Picture this. You are 16 years old. You are a king, but you cannot feel the reins of your horse because your hands are dying. Underneath the polished silver gauntlets, your skin is decomposing nerve ending by nerve ending. The leather straps bite into your palms and you feel nothing. Not even pressure, not even warmth, just the absence of yourself, spreading outward from your fingertips like frost crawling across glass. You are Baldwin IV, King of Jerusalem, and you are staring at the horizon. The dust rising there is not a storm. It is an army, 26,000 soldiers, led by the greatest conqueror of the age, are marching to burn your city to the ground. You look around you. You don't have legions. You don't have reinforcements riding in from the hills. You have 500 knights. 500 against 26,000. By every law of war, by every cold calculation of logic, you are already dead. Your body is rotting. Your kingdom is outnumbered 50 to 1. Your most experienced advisors, men who have survived decades of Crusader politics, men who have seen kingdoms rise and fall, are telling you, with genuine grief in their eyes, to flee. But you don't flee. You tighten your grip on a sword you can barely feel, and you order the charge. This is the Battle of Montgisard, the most impossible military victory of the Middle Ages, and the story of how a dying boy broke the spine of an empire. To truly understand the insanity of what happened on that November day in 1177, we have to strip away the romantic paintings, the gilded storybook illustrations, and the Hollywood dramatizations. We need to look at the biological reality of the man at the center of this storm. Because Baldwin IV was not merely a king with a disability, he was a walking corpse who refused to lie down. Leprosy in the 12th century was not simply a disease, it was a theological verdict, a curse from God rendered in flesh. In a world where sickness was understood as divine punishment, a leper was not just ill, he was condemned. Society had a ritual for this. You were given a black cloak. You were handed a bell or a wooden clapper. You were made to ring it wherever you walked, to warn the healthy of your approach. You were cast out of your home, your village, your family. You were expected to wait, slowly and publicly, for death. But Baldwin was the king of Jerusalem. He could not be cast out, so he had to rot on the throne, in full view of the court, the clergy, and the chroniclers who watched his every deterioration with morbid fascination. From the age of 9, his tutor William of Tyre first noticed something wrong. The boys had been playing, rough, jostling games the way boys do, and while the others yelped at the slightest scratch, Baldwin did not react. William dug his fingernails into the boy's forearm. Nothing. He pressed harder. The skin whitened, indented, then flushed red. Baldwin looked at him, curious, not in pain. That was the moment the tutor understood, and the moment he wished he didn't. The disease attacks the peripheral nerves first. It dismantles sensation, touch, pain, temperature, and without those warning signals, the body becomes its own enemy. A cut goes unnoticed and becomes infected. A burn is unfelt and festers. The extremities, deprived of sensation and eventually blood flow, begin to wither. Fingers curl inward, toes blacken. The face, that mirror of human identity, begins to collapse, the nose flattening, the brow thickening, the eyes clouding over as the nerves behind them die one by one. By the age of 16, the age when most young squires were dreaming of tournament glory, of a bride, of a future, Baldwin was already managing the mathematics of decline. He knew with absolute certainty that he would never grow old. He would never marry. He would never have children to carry his bloodline forward. He was a dead end. A final chapter written in the body of a teenager. And yet, this decaying boy was the only thing standing between the Christian world and total annihilation. What the chroniclers never quite managed to articulate, and what we must pause to feel, is the psychological dimension of Baldwin's existence. Imagine waking every morning knowing your body is a little less your own than it was the day before. Imagine dressing for court, wrapping bandages over the parts of yourself you can no longer bear to look at, and then sitting on a golden throne while ambassadors bow and petitioners plead and enemies calculate how long you have left. There is a specific kind of grief in being a young person who has been robbed of a future, but there is also, in rare souls, a specific kind of liberation. When you have already lost everything you are supposed to want from life, fear loses its purchase, death becomes less a threat and more a deadline, and deadlines, as any cornered man knows, have a way of clarifying what matters. Baldwin IV had no future to protect. He had only today, and on this particular today, an empire was marching toward Jerusalem, and someone had to stop it. He looked at his bandaged hands. He looked at the horizon. He ordered his horse saddled. Pardieu, the eagle and the island. If Baldwin IV was the dying light of the Christian world, then Saladin was the rising sun of the Islamic East. And to truly grasp the impossibility of Montgisard, we cannot look at Saladin as a villain in a storybook. We must see him as his contemporaries saw him, as a titan, with 1177. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub was 40 years old. He was in the absolute prime of his physical and mental faculties, lean, sharp-eyed, possessed of a restless intelligence that made him as dangerous in a diplomatic chamber as on a battlefield. He had not inherited his power. He had built it, brick by brick, campaign by campaign, through a combination of military brilliance, political cunning, and a gift for making men believe that following him was not merely a career choice but a sacred calling. He was not merely a warlord. He was a statesman of genius-level intellect who had achieved what decades of Muslim rulers before him had catastrophically failed to do. He had ended the chaos. Close your eyes and picture the map of the Middle East during the decades before Saladin. The Crusader states, those 4 fragile Christian kingdoms carved out along the Levantine coast after the First Crusade, had survived not because they were powerful, but because their enemies were distracted. Damascus quarrelled with Cairo. Aleppo feuded with Mosul. The great cities of the Islamic world spent as much energy fighting each other as they spent fighting the Franks. The Crusaders were expert at exploiting these fractures, playing rival factions against one another. Surviving in the cracks between colliding empires, Saladin sealed those cracks. He moved first on Egypt, seizing the staggering wealth of the Nile Valley, the grain, the gold, the trade routes, the administrative machinery of one of the oldest civilizations on earth. Then he turned north and took Syria. Suddenly, the kingdom of Jerusalem was no longer a neighbour to squabbling rivals. It was an island surrounded by a single, unified sea of green. To the south, Saladin's Egypt. To the east and north, Saladin's Syria. The noose had been drawn tight around the throat of the Crusader world. All that remained was to kick away the chair, and the army he assembled to do it was a masterpiece of logistical terror. 26,000 men. In the modern imagination, shaped by the industrial carnage of 20th century warfare. That number might sound modest, but in the 12th century, in the logistical nightmare of the Levantine desert, moving 26,000 men and their horses, their water, their weapons and their supply chains was the equivalent of relocating a small city across some of the most punishing terrain on earth. Every man needed water. Every horse needed fodder. Every sword needed a hand strong enough to swing it. This was not a ragtag militia fired up on religious enthusiasm and marching on empty stomachs. This was a professional, multinational force, funded by the seemingly bottomless reserves of Egyptian gold, organized with the precision of a machine. At its iron core were the Mamluks. The Mamluks deserve a moment of focused attention, because without understanding them, the Battle of Montgisard makes no sense. These were slave soldiers, purchased as boys from the Turkic steppes of Central Asia, torn from their families, converted to Islam, and raised from childhood with a single, totalizing purpose: war. They did not fight for wages. They did not fight for land. They fought because warfare was the only identity they had ever been given. And they were ferociously, almost supernaturally good at it. They were elite horse archers, capable of firing devastating volleys of arrows with terrifying accuracy while riding at a full gallop, a skill that required years of daily practice beginning in early childhood. They wore layered armour, rode horses bred specifically for speed and stamina, and maintained a unit cohesion that bordered on the fanatical pace. In any medieval military equation, the Mamluks were the variable that changed everything. Surrounding this elite corps were thousands of light cavalry drawn from the desert tribes, men who moved like the wind across terrain that would exhaust a European warhorse. Striking and fluid, swarming formations that were almost impossible to pin down, and marching behind them came the Sudanese heavy infantry, renowned across the Islamic world for their almost supernatural endurance and their willingness to absorb punishment that would shatter lesser soldiers. Imagine standing on a ridge and watching this force move across the plain below you. It would have stretched for miles in every direction. The sound alone would have been physically overwhelming. The thunder of hooves, the grinding of iron-rimmed wagon wheels, the bellowing of camels, the clanking of 10,000 swords against 10,000 shields. It would have felt less like an army and more like a weather event. An Ilaman march programs an extinction event on the march. But Saladin's greatest weapon in the autumn of 1177 was not his Mamluks, not his gold, not his logistical superiority. It was his confidence, and this is precisely where the seed of his catastrophic mistake was planted. Saladin was a man of rigorous logic. He looked at the intelligence reports flowing in from his spies inside the Kingdom of Jerusalem and processed them with the cold clarity of a chess grandmaster. What did the reports tell him? They told him the kingdom was hemorrhaging. The barons were fighting each other over the question of succession. The treasury was strained. The main military strength, the heavy cavalry, the bulk of the Templars and Hospitallers, the great lords of the realm, had inexplicably marched north to Syria on a campaign that served no clear strategic purpose, leaving the southern approaches to Jerusalem essentially unguarded. And on the throne of this crumbling, the hollowed-out kingdom sat a 16-year-old boy whose body was actively decomposing. In the Islamic worldview of the era, physical health was deeply intertwined with spiritual standing. A man in his prime, vigorous, strong, fertile, was a man upon whom God had smiled. A leper, by contrast, was a man God had visibly, publicly abandoned. To Saladin, Baldwin IV was not a rival. He was a tragic footnote. He was a symbol of a kingdom that heaven itself had already condemned. Saladin did not hate Baldwin. He almost certainly pitied him. He didn't see a chess opponent across the board. He saw a corpse that hadn't received the message yet. This psychological underestimation is the fulcrum upon which the entire battle turns. When Saladin crossed the border and bypassed the fortress of Ascalon, leaving only a thin blocking force to contain the Leper King inside, then turning his vast army northward toward the undefended prize of Jerusalem. He was not being reckless. He was being logical. He was doing what any rational commander would do when confronted with a crippled enemy trapped behind walls with 500 men. He was ignoring him, and in doing so, he made the only mistake that mattered. He had looked at Baldwin IV and seen only the body, the bandaged hands, the masked face, the borrowed time. He had failed entirely to see what was burning behind the young king's eyes. He had calculated the weight of the armour and forgotten to calculate the weight of the soul wearing it. The army spread out across the plains of Ramla and Lydda, relaxed and confident, already behaving like conquerors on a victory tour. The soldiers broke formation to raid villages, steal livestock, burn crops. The tight, lethal fist of the Ayyubid war machine opened up into a loose, lazy hand. Behind them, the gates of Ascalon were still closed, but not for long. There is a particular kind of dread that comes not from facing a monster directly, but from realizing you have left the back door open. That was the Kingdom of Jerusalem in November 1177. Not a fortress under siege, not a kingdom bracing for impact, a house with the lights on and nobody home, and a very large, very dangerous stranger already walking through the rooms. The military catastrophe that made Montgisard both necessary and almost suicidal had its roots in a strategic miscalculation made weeks before Saladin ever crossed the border. The bulk of the Crusader fighting strength, the famous barons with their household knights, the heavy infantry, the vast majority of the warrior monks of the temple and the hospital, had marched north into Syria. They had gone chasing the shadow of Saladin's movements in the north, completely misreading the Sultan's true intentions, leaving the southern approach to Jerusalem guarded by little more than skeleton garrisons and wishful thinking. It was one of the great intelligence failures of the medieval era. While the Crusader lords were looking north, Saladin was already moving south. He entered the kingdom not like a ram breaking down a gate, but like water finding a crack, flowing through the undefended passes, bypassing fortifications that had no men to defend them, moving with a speed and confidence that spoke of a man who already knew the house was empty. Baldwin IV had rushed to the coastal fortress of Ascalon with whatever scraps of manpower he could scrape together. Ascalon was no ordinary town, known throughout the region as the Bride of Syria. It was a massive, heavily walled coastal stronghold that commanded the road between Egypt and Jerusalem, the strategic artery of the entire southern Levant. Whoever controlled Ascalon controlled the corridor. Baldwin understood this. Getting there quickly was the right instinct, but the moment he arrived, the trap snapped shut behind him. Saladin, demonstrating the tactical intelligence that made him so dangerous, did not stop to besiege the city. Sieges were slow, expensive, and tedious, the kind of operation that consumed armies and months without glory. Instead, he detached a blocking force, just enough men to seal the gates and keep the Christians pinned inside. And then he kept moving. It was elegant and brutal in equal measure. He hadn't trapped Baldwin, he had simply rendered him irrelevant. Or so he believed. Now picture the scene inside the walls of Ascalon. The streets are crowded with soldiers, horses, servant, and terrified civilians who have fled the surrounding countryside. The air smells of sweat, animal dung, and fear. The heat, even in November, is relentless inside the stone corridors of the fortress. Men climb the ramparts not to fight but simply to look, and what they see makes the stomach drop. Directly outside the walls, the Muslim blocking force sits just beyond arrow range, patient and unhurried, their banners moving lazily in the coastal breeze, and beyond them, further inland, rising from the villages and farms of the plain, columns of black smoke climb into the pale afternoon sky. One column, then another, then a third, then so many that the horizon itself seems to be burning. Those columns of smoke were not abstract. To the soldiers standing on the walls of Ascalon, many of whom were natives of this land, that smoke was personal. It was rising from farms their fathers had built, from villages where their cousins still lived, from churches where they had been baptized. Every plume represented a massacre, a family destroyed, a generation of labour turned to ash, and they could do nothing but watch it happen, trapped behind stone walls, impotent and furious, because their numbers were too few and their king was a dying teenager. The war council that gathered inside Ascalon in those suffocating hours was not a meeting of cowards. These were experienced fighting men, veterans of the brutal, unforgiving world of Crusader politics, men who had survived ambushes and sieges and palace coups. They looked at the situation with clear eyes and they arrived at the same cold conclusion: stay put. To ride out against 26,000 men with 500 knights was not bravery. It was arithmetic. In the open desert, without walls, without fortifications, without the geographic advantages that could neutralize Saladin's numerical superiority. 500 against 26,000 was not a battle. It was a feeding frenzy. It was handing the Sultan the one thing he currently lacked: a clean, decisive, total victory. The kind of victory that would break not just an army, but a civilization's will to resist. Every experienced man in that room knew this. They laid it out for their king with the careful, sorrowful patience of men delivering a death sentence they did not want to pronounce. Baldwin IV listened, and then he did what no one in that room had predicted. He asked for his armour. What drove him to that decision cannot be fully explained by military calculation, because military calculation argued against it overwhelmingly. What drove Baldwin was something older and stranger and more powerful than strategy. It was the particular psychology of a man who has been living with a death sentence since the age of 9. Here is what his advisors could not factor into their equations. Baldwin IV had already made his peace with dying. He had done it years ago. Quietly. In the dark hours of sleepless nights when the pain was a distant, muffled thing, and the future was a corridor he could see clearly, ended in a wall. He had grieved his unlived life. He had buried his ambitions, his hopes for children, his dreams of growing old. He had done the emotional work that most men never do, because most men can pretend the wall isn't there. A man who has already accepted death does not make the same calculations as a man who is still clinging to life. Baldwin looked beyond the military logic to something his commanders had stopped seeing because they were too focused on survival. If he stayed behind the walls of Ascalon, Saladin would bypass him, was already bypassing him, and march directly to Jerusalem. The holy city would fall while its king cowered in a fortress 30 miles away. The Crusader world would watch its anointed king, the defender of the faith, choose his own safety over the city of Christ. For Baldwin, that was not a survivable outcome. Not because he feared death. He had long since stopped fearing that, but because he feared something worse. He feared becoming the king who let Jerusalem fall without raising a sword. He feared that the leprosy rotting his body would also be allowed to rot his legacy. His meaning, his reason for having existed at all. He could not feel his hands, but he could still choose what those hands reached for. He reached for his sword. The gates of Ascalon opened just before dawn. Not slowly, not cautiously. They swung wide with the deliberate force of a decision that had already been made and would not be unmade. The sound of the iron hinges must have carried across the still morning air like a declaration. Inside, the column was already moving, horses stamping, armour clanking softly in the pre-dawn dark, men pulling straps tight and whispering prayers into the necks of their mounts. Saladin's blocking force outside the walls was not expecting this. That is the critical detail. The Sultan had left those men with a simple, almost contemptuous assignment: keep the cripple inside. It had not occurred to anyone in the Ayyubid command that the cripple might come out swinging. The blocking force was sized for containment, not combat. A screen, not a wall, and screams. When hit with sudden, concentrated violence, do not hold. The Crusaders did not ease their way out. They erupted. The knights of the vanguard hit the thin Muslim cordon at full gallop. Lances levelled. War horses carrying 500 pounds of armoured momentum into men who were still reaching for their weapons. The blocking force shattered on contact. Those who could ran. Those who couldn't were ridden down. The breakthrough took minutes. Brutal. Savage. Decisive minutes. And then the column was free. Streaming north along the coastal road with the cold Mediterranean wind at their backs and the burning interior of their kingdom visible on the eastern horizon. The easy part was over. What came next was the thing that separates this story from every other desperate cavalry charge in medieval history. Once clear of the city, Baldwin did not turn south toward Egypt and safety. He did not ride east into the hills to find a defensible position and wait. He turned north, directly toward the rear of a 26,000-man army that did not yet know he was coming. He was not retreating from the lion. He was hunting it, 500 knights, riding hard along the coast, pushing their horses toward the ragged edge of endurance, chasing the enormous dust cloud that hung over Saladin's army like a permanent bruise on the sky. They rode with the knowledge that if they were spotted too early, if a patrol turned, if a scout looked back, the entire host would wheel around and swallow them whole. There was no second attempt available. There was no fallback plan. There was only speed and the gamble that arrogance makes men blind. But before we follow the dust north, we must pause and look more carefully at what was riding with those 500 men, because they were not carrying only swords and lances. They were carrying something that, in the context of the 12th century, transformed a suicide mission into something categorically different. Riding in the column, cradled in the arms of the Bishop of Bethlehem, was the true cross. To a modern observer, this requires translation. What the bishop carried was a golden reliquary, an ornate, jewelled container, housing what the Christian world believed was a fragment of the actual wooden cross upon which Jesus Christ had been crucified. In an age when the physical and the spiritual were not separated the way we separate them today, this was not merely a symbol, it was a presence. It was God made tangible, God choosing to march with them, God's own endorsement of what they were about to do. For the knights riding behind it, the theological implications were staggering and immediate. If they died in battle while defending the true cross, their salvation was not merely hoped for, it was guaranteed. Death was reframed from catastrophe to consecration. The natural, animal terror that should have paralyzed 500 men riding toward 26,000 was suppressed by something more powerful than courage, certainty. They knew where they were going when they died. The only question was how many enemies they would take with them. This is not superstition. This is psychology. And in the economy of a medieval battle, where morale was often more decisive than numbers, the true cross was the most powerful weapon in the Crusader arsenal. Baldwin knew this. He had insisted it come, but while his army had the relic to carry them forward, Baldwin had only his disintegrating body, and it was failing him in real time. Mile by mile, as the column pushed north, riding a warhorse is an intensely physical act even for a healthy man. It demands core strength, constant balance adjustment, the continuous manipulation of reins and stirrups, the absorption of each jolting stride through thighs, hips, and spine under the desert sun. Even in November, the heat inside chainmail is suffocating, a metal shell that traps body warmth and radiates it back inward, turning the rider into something resembling a slowly heated oven. For Baldwin, every element of this was amplified into a private ordeal of extraordinary cruelty. The leprosy had long since deadened the nerves in his hands and feet. But that numbness was not mercy. It was a trap. You cannot feel the reins digging into your palms, which means you cannot know if your grip is adequate until the leather slides through your fingers and you lose control of a 1,200-pound animal moving at speed. You cannot feel the stirrups beneath your feet, so your balance is permanently compromised, your body lurching with each stride in ways a healthy rider corrects instinctively. To compensate, Baldwin had to clamp his thighs against the saddle with every ounce of strength he possessed, locking himself in place through pure muscular effort until his legs burned with an exhaustion he could feel, even when he could feel nothing else. Beneath the layers of silk undergarments, linen bandages, padded gambeson, and chainmail hauberk, the heat was building towards something intolerable. The friction of the armour against his lesions would have caused bleeding he could not feel, blood soaking silently into the bandages, pooling in his boots. The body consuming itself without sending the distress signals, a healthy nervous system would scream. He was riding through a private storm of heat stroke and accelerating physical damage, held upright by a willpower that his own physicians would later describe with a mixture of awe and horror. Surrounding this fragile, burning core of a king was the steel backbone of the column, the Knights Templar, led by their Grand Master, Odo de Saint-Amand. Odo was not a warm man. History records him as proud, inflexible, and frequently insufferable, the kind of commander who made enemies at diplomatic functions and won battles through sheer, grinding refusal to accept defeat. He had spent his adult life inside the brutal monastery of Templar discipline, where the rule was absolute and the vow was permanent. A Templar did not retreat unless outnumbered 3-1. Here, outnumbered 50-1. Odo did not even discuss the option. He gathered his 80 Templar knights around the king and the cross and formed the vanguard. an armoured fist at the tip of the column, and he rode north with the same expression he probably wore to morning prayers. His fanaticism, usually a political liability, was in this moment precisely what the army needed. It was contagious. Men looked at the Grand Master's unbending posture and found their own spines straightening. Together, the dying boy king, the rigid fanatic, and the fragment of sacred wood, this strange coalition moved north along the coast at a pace that surprised even their own scouts. They were covering ground faster than the enemy expected anything to move. Saladin's scouts had lost track of them in the aftermath of the breakout. The Sultan, still directing his leisurely march toward Jerusalem, had no intelligence of their position. Then the scouts came galloping back to Baldwin, horses lathered, faces pale beneath the dust. The enemy was just ahead, not a patrol, not a rearguard screening force. The entire host, spread across the plain near a low hill called el-Jezah, disorganized, strung out across miles of road. Many of the soldiers dismounted, armour stowed in wagons to escape the afternoon heat. Horses drinking at the stream that crossed the valley. Baldwin stopped his horse. He looked at his 500 knights, caked in dust, horses foaming at the bit, the true cross glinting in the slanted afternoon light at the centre of the column. Ahead of them, an ocean of enemies who did not yet know they were about to drown. There was no time for a council of war. There was no time for complex tactics or elaborate formations. There was only the shock of contact, and the shrinking window of surprise that would close the moment. A single enemy scout looked south and saw what was coming. The king dismounted. It was a struggle, his limbs stiff and unresponsive, his grooms rushing to support him. He fell to his knees in the sand before the true cross. The entire column went silent. The only sounds were the wind moving through the scrub grass and, faintly, the distant murmur of 26,000 men who had no idea they were about to meet God's answer to their confidence. Baldwin prayed aloud. His voice cracked. He wept, and then he stood up, and the tears were gone. And he looked at his men with eyes that contained something beyond courage, something that the chronicles struggle to name, but that every soldier in that column recognized immediately. He did not need to speak. He simply raised his sword. The ground began to tremble before anyone on Saladin's side understood what that trembling meant. At first it registered as something geological, a low, rhythmic vibration moving up through the soles of boots, through the legs of horses, into the chests of men who were busy watering animals and counting stolen cattle. The Jordan Rift Valley was no stranger to earthquakes. Soldiers glanced at each other, mildly curious. Then the vibration sharpened into sound. A deep, drumming thunder rising from the south, and the veterans among them went rigid with recognition. That was hoofbeats, heavy cavalry hoofbeats, and they were coming fast. The alarm spread unevenly, which made it worse. The men at the rear of the column heard it first and began screaming. But the army was strung out across miles of road, and a scream travelled slowly through 26,000 men busy with their own business. By the time the warning reached the soldiers near the front, the banners were already visible, gold crosses on white fields, the stark black and white standard of the Templars, and at the centre, catching the slanted afternoon sun like a torch, the gleaming reliquary of the true cross. For a few frozen seconds, Saladin's soldiers simply stared. Then panic hit them like a physical force. Panic in an ancient army is not merely emotional. It is tactical annihilation. It spreads faster than fire through dry grass. And it is almost impossible to stop once it has a foothold. The soldiers nearest the charging column had no armour. It was packed in wagons. Their horses were unmounted. Drinking at the stream, their weapons were sheathed or stacked. They were caught in the worst possible configuration, strung out in column of march, unable to form a battle line, unable to manoeuvre, unable to do anything except absorb what was coming. Baldwin did not stop. He did not offer terms. He did not slow to assess. He released the charge, to understand why 500 men could detonate an army of 26,000. You need to understand the physics of what a Frankish knight actually was. This was not a man on a horse. This was a weapon system. 1,000 pounds of armoured horse and armoured rider moving at 30 miles per hour, with a 10-foot ash lance tucked tight under the arm using a technique called couching. The force at the point of impact was not generated by the strength of one man's arm. It was the entire momentum of a galloping destrier, concentrated into a steel tip the diameter of a coin. When that force met an unarmoured man standing flat-footed on open ground, there was no contest. There was only physics. The Crusader wedge hit the flank of Saladin's army like a sledgehammer through glass. The sound of the initial impact, lances shattering, bones snapping, horses screaming, rolled across the plain like a thunderclap. The Ayyubid light cavalry on the exposed flank simply ceased to exist as a fighting force. They were vaporized on contact, scattered like chaff. Those who survived the first pass fleeing in every direction without looking back. The wedge drove deeper. Leading it, incredibly, was Baldwin IV, strapped into his saddle, unable to feel the reins tied around his wrists, guided by squires riding knee to knee on either side. The Leper King was at the tip of the spear. His presence there was not militarily necessary. Any competent knight could have led the charge physically, but symbolically it was everything. His men were not fighting for an absent monarch issuing orders from a safe distance. They were fighting for the boy who was bleeding alongside them, who was holding himself upright through sheer refusal to fall. They fought with a ferocity that the Muslim chroniclers would later describe, with genuine unease, as something beyond human. Odo de Saint-Amand and his 80 Templars operated as the cutting edge of the assault. Unlike the rest of the column, which was driven partly by desperation, the Templars fought with the cold precision of men who had rehearsed for exactly this kind of chaos their entire lives. They stayed in tight formation, a disciplined, grinding block of death that did not scatter, did not chase individual targets, did not stop moving. Their objective was singular and ruthless: find the yellow banners of Saladin's personal guard and drive toward them without deviation. They were not interested in foot soldiers. They were headhunting. On the other side of the collapsing battle line, Saladin watched his army come apart with the disbelief of a man whose most fundamental assumptions are being dismantled in real time. He had left a blocking force at Ascalon. He had neutralized the cripple. The mathematics were settled. The outcome was predetermined. And yet here was the cripple, somehow, impossibly, tearing through the heart of his host like a blade through wet cloth. He screamed for his Mamluks. The elite bodyguard responded with the discipline that distinguished them from every other fighting force on the field. While the conscripts and light cavalry dissolved into fleeing chaos, the Mamluks scrambled for their horses, pulled on what armour they could reach, and formed a desperate defensive ring around their sultan. They were late, and they were partially unready, but they held. For now, the baggage train, which had been Saladin's logistical triumph, now became his nightmare. The carts, the camels, the herds of stolen livestock, all of it clogged the roads behind the fighting, turning a controlled retreat into a labyrinth of blocked escape routes. Soldiers trying to flee found themselves trapped between the Crusader charge in front of them and an immovable wall of wagons behind. The narrow crossing of the valley stream became a bottleneck of crushed, desperate bodies. Saladin had built the perfect army for conquest. He had accidentally also built the perfect army for catastrophe. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon, painting the dust cloud above the battlefield in shades of copper and blood. Baldwin's horse was still moving forward. The true cross was still upright at the centre of the column, and ahead, through the smoke and the screaming, the yellow banners of the Sultan's guard were close, terrifyingly, impossibly close. The greatest conqueror of the age was no longer thinking about Jerusalem. He was thinking about survival. The first charge had broken the body of the army. What followed broke its soul. Once the initial momentum of the Crusader wedge had spent itself, lances shattered, horses slowing from gallop to canter to grinding melee, the battle transformed into something altogether uglier and more intimate. This was no longer a collision of formations. This was a knife fight inside a burning building, conducted across a valley floor blanketed in a choking mixture of dust, smoke, and the iron smell of blood so thick men could taste it on their tongues. In this environment, Saladin's numerical advantage became almost meaningless. 26,000 men who cannot maneuver, cannot form lines, cannot find their commanders through the chaos of screaming horses and blinding dust, are not an army. They are a crowd. And crowds, when punctured by disciplined violence, behave not with the coordinated resistance of soldiers but with the raw, contagious terror of trapped animals. The mist of Montgisard, that blinding cocktail of sand and sweat and smoke, was not merely atmospheric, it was the great equalizer, stripping Saladin's numerical superiority down to what it was worth in close quarters, almost nothing. Almost. Because one group did not panic, the Mamluks, while the conscript infantry streamed away into the gathering dusk and the light cavalry evaporated like water on hot stone. The Mamluk Imperial Guard held their ground around Saladin's position with a discipline that bordered on the supernatural. These were men who had been raised from boyhood to die for their sultan, not as a poetic abstraction, but as a literal, daily, operational reality. They formed a yellow wall of steel, and they held it. The Templars hit this wall and felt it push back. What followed was the hardest fighting of the day. Heavy cavalry against heavy cavalry. Armoured men on armoured horses in a grinding, exhausting contest where the elegant physics of the lance charge were useless, and everything came down to sword work and endurance. Odo de Saint-Amand drove his knights into the Mamluk line again and again, each assault chewing away at the edges. Each repulse costing men the column could not afford to lose. Inside this maelstrom, impossibly, was Baldwin IV. By every medical calculation, the king should have been unconscious. The heat, the exertion, the cumulative physical damage of the ride and the charge. Any one of these factors alone would have hospitalized a healthy man. Together, in a body already ravaged by leprosy, they should have been fatal. Yet the chronicles insist he was there, in the thick of it, sword moving. What kept him upright was not medicine. It was the men watching him, every Crusader knight who glanced up through the chaos and saw the king's standard still flying, saw the golden helmet still moving forward rather than falling, found something in himself he had not known was there. If the dying boy could endure this, the logic ran, then exhaustion was simply not an acceptable reason to stop. Baldwin had become something beyond a commander. He was a living argument against surrender, a proof, written in suffering, that the body could be commanded to do what the mind deemed impossible. Saladin, fighting to hold his position at the centre of the disintegrating host. Watch the battle with the anguish of a man who understands exactly what is happening and cannot stop it. He saw his nephew Taqi al-Din fighting with desperate brilliance, throwing his own men into the Templar assault to buy the Sultan precious seconds. He saw his grandnephew, a young man of extraordinary promise, cut down before he could reach him. The invincibility of the Ayyubid dynasty, carefully constructed over years of unbroken victory, was being dismantled piece by piece by a cripple on horseback. The psychological damage was as severe as the physical. Saladin was a man whose authority rested partly on the perception of divine favour. Victory after victory had reinforced the narrative. God was with the Sultan. God was clearing his path to Jerusalem. God had chosen him as the instrument of Islamic restoration. Montgisard was dismantling that narrative in real time, in front of his own soldiers, and there was nothing he could do to stop the dismantling. Then the Mamluk line broke. It did not bend gradually. It did not retreat in good order. It collapsed. Suddenly. Completely. The way a wall collapses when the last supporting stone is removed. The Templars had found the weakness, a gap between two units created by casualties and the chaos of repeated charges, and they drove into it with everything they had left. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary images in medieval military history. The Mamluks, the finest soldiers in the Islamic world. Men who did not know how to run, ran, but they did not run to save themselves. In their final, terrible act of loyalty, they threw themselves at the Templar horses, dying in clusters to create confusion, to buy their sultan the seconds he needed. It was a sacrifice as deliberate as it was devastating. They traded their lives for his escape, and they did it without hesitation, because that was what they had been made for. Saladin escaped, but the manner of his escape is what history must linger on, because it contains the full measure of what Baldwin IV had achieved in a single afternoon. The greatest conqueror of the Middle East, the man who had united Egypt and Syria, who commanded the resources of an empire stretching from the Nile to the Tigris, who had reduced the kingdom of Jerusalem to a trembling island, did not ride out of Montgisard on his magnificent war stallion, banners flying, dignity intact. He jumped onto a racing camel, a baggage animal, a beast of burden, chosen not for martial glory but for raw speed across open desert. He whipped it south through the darkening plain, surrounded by only a handful of guards, leaving behind his tent, his baggage train, his personal belongings, his army, and the unfinished business of Jerusalem. He did not stop to rally stragglers. He did not pause to organize a rearguard. He ran, through the twilight, through the rising cold, putting as much desert between himself and the Leper King as his exhausted camel could manage. Behind him, the mist of Montgisard turned a deep, permanent red. With the Sultan gone, the last resistance evaporated. The remaining soldiers, 20,000 men who had marched into Palestine 10 days ago as the most powerful military force in the region, simply stopped fighting. They threw down weapons, stripped off armour to run faster, and fled south in every direction at once, a human tide pouring back toward Egypt with the desperate, mindless energy of men who have looked into the face of something they cannot explain and chosen not to look again. Baldwin IV halted his horse on the blood-soaked plain. He had done it. The swords were sheathed, the lances were broken, the dust was settling, and then the sky opened up, in a twist that the Christian chroniclers seized upon with barely concealed triumph. The weather turned against Saladin's broken army with the precision of a closing trap. The Levant in late November is not the sun-baked desert of popular imagination. The winters arrive suddenly and without mercy, cold fronts sweeping in off the Mediterranean, dropping temperatures with shocking speed, turning the afternoon warmth into a freezing, rain-lashed nightmare within hours. As the remnants of the Ayyubid host scattered south across the coastal plain, the clouds gathered and burst. It was the iron hammer that shattered what the Crusader charge had merely cracked. Picture the situation of a fleeing Egyptian soldier in those first hours after Montgisard. You have thrown away your armour. It was too heavy to run in, and running was the only thought in your head when the Templar line broke through. Your water skin is empty, lost somewhere in the chaos of the rout. You have no food. You have no map. You are running south toward Egypt, which lies hundreds of miles away across the Sinai Peninsula, one of the most hostile landscapes on earth. A furnace of sand and rock that kills the unprepared with calm, bureaucratic efficiency. And now the temperature is dropping. The rain is turning the dust beneath your feet into freezing mud that sucks at your boots with every step. The wind is cutting through your thin tunic like a blade. For the next 10 days, what had begun as a military retreat became something that belongs less to the history of warfare and more to the literature of catastrophe. The Bedouin tribes of the region, who had previously maintained a careful neutrality, intimidated by Saladin's power or paid off by his gold, now smelled blood with the ancient instinct of desert people who have always known that the best time to take from the strong is when they have just become weak. They emerge from the dunes and the scrubland in raiding parties, harassing the stragglers, cutting off the isolated groups, stripping the dead and the dying of everything: weapons, clothing, boots, and leaving them naked in the freezing rain to complete the work that the cold had started. The chronicles that survive from both sides of this catastrophe paint a picture of almost biblical devastation. Men who had marched into Palestine 10 days earlier as part of the most powerful military force in the region were now dying alone in the sand, delirious with thirst, their bodies shutting down one system at a time. They died of hypothermia in a desert. They died of dehydration in winter rain. They died of wounds that went untreated because there was no one left to treat them. They died of despair, which is its own kind of wound. And at the centre of this unravelling catastrophe rode Saladin himself. Or rather, lurched. Because a racing camel at full speed is one of the least dignified modes of transport available to a medieval conqueror. The Sultan, who had dined in silken tents on the food of a dozen conquered provinces, was now drinking muddy water from puddles in the road. The man whose personal baggage train had carried enough luxury to outfit a small palace was sleeping in the open, wrapped in whatever his guards could find. His closest companions, men who had served him for years, who had ridden with him through the campaigns that built his empire, were dying around him from exposure and exhaustion, and he could do nothing for them except watch. It is recorded that during this retreat Saladin barely spoke. The garrulous, intellectually vibrant statesman who could debate theology with scholars and negotiate with ambassadors in the same afternoon was reduced to silence. He rode. He endured. He survived. But the man who arrived at the gates of Cairo after those 10 days in the desert was visibly, fundamentally changed from the man who had crossed into Palestine with 26,000 soldiers and the absolute certainty of victory. The numbers, when they were finally tallied, were staggering. Historical estimates suggest that of the 26,000 men who had marched confidently into the Kingdom of Jerusalem, barely 10% made it back to Egypt in any condition to fight. The rest, more than 20,000 men, were dead, captured, or simply gone, swallowed by the desert and the weather and the Bedouin raiders. The overwhelming majority of these deaths had nothing to do with the battle itself. They died in the rout. They died in the retreat. They died in the Sinai. Montgisard had not merely defeated an army, it had consumed one. In Cairo, the news arrived before the Sultan did, carried by the first terrified survivors stumbling through the city gates with their stories of impossible banners appearing from nowhere, and a Leper King who would not fall. The city went into mourning. Rumour spread faster than truth, as it always does. And the rumour was that Saladin was dead, killed by the Franks, or by the desert, or by God's judgment on a campaign that had somehow, incomprehensibly, gone wrong. When the Sultan finally appeared, haggard and hollowed out, the relief was complicated by the shock of what he looked like. He wrote to his brother in the days that followed, trying to explain what had happened, struggling to find language adequate to a defeat that still made no logical sense. The letter contained a line that became one of the most quoted admissions of failure in medieval Arabic literature. "We have fallen into a distress that only God can relieve, from the greatest conqueror of the age." It was a total confession. Meanwhile, 30 miles north of the disaster, the scene in Jerusalem was the precise inverse. Delirious, almost hysterical joy spilling through the streets of the holy city, like a flood that had been dammed for years. Baldwin IV rode through the gates not as a leper, not as a dying boy, but as something the city had not seen in a generation, a saviour. The bells of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre rang without stopping. People pressed forward in the narrow streets trying to touch the hem of his robe, reaching through the guards to brush the armour of the knights who had ridden with him. They did not see the bandages beneath the gauntlets. They did not see the lesions or the carefully hidden disfigurement. They saw the hand of God wearing the shape of a 16-year-old king, and they wept with a gratitude so overwhelming it had no other outlet. But the cameras of history must follow Baldwin into the privacy of his chambers, because what happened when the armour was finally removed tells the truest part of the story. The exertion had cost him everything it had to take. The lesions were worse. The disease had accelerated visibly in the days of the battle and the return march. His physicians looked at what the ride had done to his body and understood, with the quiet certainty of men who have seen this progression before, that their king had spent something irreplaceable out there in the desert. He had bought his kingdom time. He had paid for it with the last of himself. Victory has a cost that the celebrations never mention. In the weeks after Montgisard, Jerusalem celebrated with the abandon of a city that genuinely believed it had witnessed divine intervention. The churches were full, the wine flowed. The story of the 500 against the 26,000 passed from mouth to mouth, growing with each retelling until Baldwin had become something approaching legend. The anointed king whom God had personally armoured against the armies of the East. But in the quiet of the royal chambers, the legend was unwrapping his bandages. The battle had accelerated Baldwin's leprosy with the clinical indifference of a disease that does not care about miracles. The weeks of physical punishment, the forced march, the charge, the grinding melee, the return ride, had done to his body what years of careful management had been trying to prevent. The lesions had spread. The numbness was advancing further up his arms. His physicians documented the deterioration with the careful, sorrowful precision of men who understood they were watching a countdown reach its final stages. Baldwin had traded his body's remaining reserves for the survival of his kingdom. It was a transaction he had made consciously, knowingly, and without hesitation, but transactions of that kind do not offer refunds. In the courts of Europe, Paris, London, Rome, the story of Montgisard arrived like a thunderclap of inspiration. Letters and chronicles carried the tale of the Leper King's miracle across the Mediterranean, where it was received as proof that God still protected Jerusalem, that the holy city was safe, that the Crusader project remained divinely endorsed. European nobles who might otherwise have sent money or soldiers relaxed. Heaven was clearly handling the situation. They did not understand that heaven's instrument was running out of time. Saladin understood it perfectly. Montgisard had traumatized him in ways that went beyond military calculation. He had looked into the face of something he could not explain. A dying boy who should have stayed behind walls and instead broke his army. And he had drawn the only logical conclusion available to an intelligent man. As long as Baldwin IV breathed, the kingdom of Jerusalem possessed something that numbers and gold could not overcome. Some quality of will, or spirit, or divine protection. Saladin was not sure which, that made conventional military logic unreliable. So he changed his strategy entirely. He stopped seeking the decisive pitched battle. He became instead the patient predator, circling, probing, testing the borders, raiding the periphery, watching and waiting for the one development that would finally make the kingdom vulnerable. He rebuilt his army with even greater discipline, drawing lessons from every mistake Montgisard had exposed, and he waited for Baldwin to die. It was, in its cold way, the greatest compliment he could have paid. The years that followed were a slow, agonizing rearguard action fought simultaneously on two fronts, against Saladin on the borders, and against the disease consuming the king from within. By his early 20s, Baldwin was blind. The bacteria had methodically destroyed the optic nerves, pulling a permanent darkness down over a young man who had already lost so much. His hands, long since robbed of sensation, became functionally useless as the structural damage progressed. He could no longer grip a sword. He could no longer mount a horse unassisted. Yet he continued to rule. And in one moment that crystallizes everything essential about Baldwin IV, he continued to lead. In 1083, 6 years after Montgisard, Saladin besieged the great Crusader fortress of Kerak in the desert of Moab. The castle's defenders sent desperately for relief. The Crusader army mobilized, and at its head, carried on a litter, a stretcher slung between two patient horses, was the blind, crippled king of Jerusalem, personally present on the campaign because he refused to govern his kingdom's defense from a comfortable room in a palace. When Saladin received intelligence that Baldwin was with the army, not commanding from a city, not delegating to a regent, but physically present in the field, lying on a stretcher in the dust, he withdrew from Kerak without pressing the siege. The mere existence of the Leper King was still enough to make the greatest conqueror of the age recalculate his odds. But while Baldwin held the external line through sheer force of presence, the internal line was collapsing entirely. The Crusader court was not filled with men of Baldwin's caliber, As his physical condition worsened and his grip on the daily machinery of government weakened, the ambitious and the reckless moved to fill the vacuum with a speed that was almost indecent. Guy of Lusignan, handsome, charming, and strategically catastrophic, manoeuvred himself into a position of enormous influence through his marriage to Baldwin's sister Sibylla. Reynaud of Châtillon, a warlord of almost sociopathic recklessness, operated on the kingdom's eastern frontier like a man personally determined to provoke Saladin into a response that the kingdom could not survive. He raided Muslim caravans. He broke truces. He once launched a naval expedition into the Red Sea, threatening the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, purely for plunder, an act of such breathtaking provocation that it made diplomatic recovery nearly impossible. Baldwin, trapped in his darkening world of blindness and pain, tried to contain them. He issued orders, appointed regents, arranged and then cancelled political marriages, attempted to construct a succession that would preserve something of the careful balance he had maintained at such enormous personal cost. But a blind king on a litter, however fierce his will, has limited tools for controlling men who have decided they no longer need to be controlled. The kingdom was eating itself alive, and Baldwin could hear it happening but could not stop it. In 1185, at the age of 24, Baldwin IV died. He had lived approximately 15 years longer than his initial diagnosis suggested was possible. He had fought a war against an empire with 500 men and won. He had checked the greatest general of the age through the sheer, irrational force of his refusal to behave like a dying man. And in the end, the leprosy took what everything else had failed to take: the king himself. When the news reached Damascus, Saladin did not celebrate. There was no public rejoicing, no triumphant proclamation. Those who were present reported that the Sultan received the intelligence in solemn silence. He had respected Baldwin more than any of the healthy, ambitious men now scrambling for the vacant throne, respected him with the particular, uncomfortable respect that a great predator reserves for the one prey that ever made it run. He knew what Baldwin's death meant. The soul of the kingdom had departed. What remained was the body, the walls, the castles, the titles, the barons, but without the animating spirit that had held it together through sheer, impossible will. The game was now fair, and in a fair game, Saladin would not lose again. 2 years later, at the Horns of Hattin, he proved it, annihilating the Crusader army, capturing the True Cross, and riding into Jerusalem as its conqueror. Everything Baldwin had bled to protect was gone within 24 months of his death. The miracle of 1177 had bought the kingdom a decade. The kingdom had spent that decade unworthily. Jerusalem fell on October 2nd. 1187, Saladin rode through the gates of the holy city on a white horse, 10 years almost to the day after a dying boy had saved it from him on the plains of Montgisard. The contrast with the Crusaders' original conquest of Jerusalem, 88 years earlier, was deliberate and devastating. Where the first Crusaders had massacred the population indiscriminately, Muslims, youths, and Eastern Christians alike, Saladin offered terms. Those who could pay a ransom walked free. Those who couldn't were enslaved, but not slaughtered. He purified the Al-Aqsa Mosque with rosewater and restored it to prayer. He was magnanimous in victory. He was everything his admirers claimed him to be. And as the long columns of Crusader refugees streamed out through the city gates, beginning their desolate walk toward the coast and whatever came after, the memory of Montgisard must have felt to them like something from another world entirely. A fever dream of golden banners and impossible charges. A moment when God had seemingly intervened and then, inexplicably, changed his mind. How had they fallen so far? So fast? The answer is brutal and simple. They had forgotten the lesson Baldwin IV had written in his own blood on the sand near Tel el-Jezah. Survival in the Crusader East demanded unity, speed, moral clarity, and the willingness to act against comfortable logic when the situation required it. Baldwin had embodied all four simultaneously. At 16, with a body that was actively killing him, Guy of Lusignan and Reynold of Châtillon embodied none of them. At Hattin in 1187, Saladin had laid the same kind of trap that Baldwin had sprung on him at Montgisard, bait designed to pull an enemy out of a strong position into a vulnerable one. Baldwin would have recognised it immediately. Guy of Lusignan marched the entire military strength of the kingdom into a waterless plateau in high summer, straight into the jaws of a man who had spent a decade studying exactly how to destroy them. The Crusaders arrived at Hattin dehydrated, disorganised, and choking on brush fires lit deliberately by Saladin's forces to blind and suffocate them before a single sword was drawn. It was the anti-Montgisard in every particular, where Baldwin had used speed, surprise, and psychological shock. Guy offered slowness, predictability, and panic, where Baldwin had charged into chaos and created order through sheer violent momentum. The army at Hattin dissolved into chaos and never recovered. The true cross, that same fragment of sacred wood that the Bishop of Bethlehem had carried through the breakout from Ascalon, that had ridden at the centre of 500 knights charging 26,000, was captured at Hattin. Saladin had it paraded upside down through the streets of Damascus. For the Christian world, it was a psychological wound deeper than the loss of any city. The symbol of God's presence on the battlefield had been taken prisoner. The argument that heaven endorsed the Crusader project had been, publicly and humiliatingly, refuted. Baldwin had carried that cross to victory. His successors had carried it to catastrophe. The Battle of Montgisard then faded, not immediately, but gradually, into the margins of historical memory. It became a footnote, an inconvenient miracle tucked between the grand narrative arcs of the Crusades. There are understandable reasons for this. History, despite its pretensions to objectivity, tends to organise itself around outcomes. The Crusades ended badly for the Crusaders. It is psychologically easier to remember Richard the Lionheart, who came later and fought Saladin to a celebrated draw, than to reckon seriously with the disfigured teenager who actually defeated him. Saladin never forgot. This is perhaps the most remarkable testament to what Baldwin achieved. Until his death in 1193, the Sultan spoke of the Leper King with a combination of dread and reverence that he extended to no other Christian commander. Not Richard, not the Hospitaller Grand Masters, not any of the capable, healthy, fully functioning warriors who had opposed him across his career. The one man who had genuinely frightened him, the one opponent whose psychology he admitted he had fundamentally misread, was the boy he had dismissed as a corpse that hadn't stopped breathing. Baldwin had made the greatest conqueror of the age run. That fact does not diminish when Jerusalem falls. It does not shrink when Hattin happens. It stands alone, permanent and impossible. On a dusty plain in November 1177, 500 against 26,000, and the 500 won. So why, 8.5 centuries later, has this story exploded back into cultural consciousness? Why is Baldwin IV suddenly everywhere? On social media feeds, in YouTube algorithms, in the conversations of people who have no particular interest in medieval history, but find themselves unable to stop thinking about a leper king on a borrowed horse? The answer has nothing to do with medieval scholarship and everything to do with the question Baldwin's life forces us to confront directly. What do you do when existence itself seems designed against you? We live in an era obsessed with optimization, with health, appearance, productivity, the curated performance of a life going according to plan. Baldwin IV lost access to all of that before he reached adolescence. He was handed the worst possible combination of circumstances, a body that was destroying itself, a timeline measured in years rather than decades, and an enemy 50 times his size gathering on the horizon. By every metric available to his advisors, his physicians, and his enemies, he was already finished. He refused to behave accordingly. This is the philosophical statement that Montgisard makes. and it is more powerful than any tactical lesson it contains. The battle proves that numerical disadvantage is not the same as defeat. It proves that a body in collapse can still be commanded by a will that has not collapsed. It proves that the most dangerous human being in any situation is not the strongest or the healthiest or the best resourced. It is the one who has accepted the worst outcome and decided to act anyway. Saladin won the geopolitical contest. He retook Jerusalem. His legacy endured. By the conventional measures of historical success, he is the victor of this story. But Baldwin won something Saladin could never take back. He won the moral victory, the proof, written permanently into the record, that the spirit can outlast the body's willingness to cooperate. He forced the greatest general of his age to look at a dying boy and feel, for the first and last time in his life, genuine fear. When we look at those 500 knights riding into the dust cloud of 26,000, we are not watching a medieval skirmish. We are watching a metaphor that has never stopped being relevant. We all have our own Ascalon, the fortress we hide in because the enemy outside is too large, because the math is wrong, because every sensible voice in the room is telling us that survival requires stillness. And, somewhere beyond those walls, the kingdom is burning. Baldwin's answer, delivered across 8 centuries in the language of a November charge across a coastal plain, is not complicated. It does not require a healthy body or favourable odds or the approval of your advisors. Tighten your grip on whatever you can still hold, and ride out anyway.